I returned home from my sister's funeral and found my belongings thrown across the yard. My daughter-in-law stood on the porch, smiling proudly, and said, "Those old things don't matter anymore." So I picked up my phone and decided it was time to remove useless things from my life too. The first thing I noticed was my grandmother's shawl on top of a garbage bag. That is the image I will carry for the rest of my life. 70 years of wool, cream and pale gold, hand-stitched by a woman who survived worse things than I can imagine, draped over a black plastic bag like it was a dish rag, like it was nothing, like the woman who made it was nothing. I had just buried my sister Grace 4 hours earlier in Phoenix under a white sky that hurt to look at. I still had funeral dust on my flats. My black dress, the good one, the one Grace always said made me look like I meant business, was wrinkled from the flight. I had not eaten since the night before. I had cried in a rental car in the airport parking lot for 22 minutes before I could see well enough to drive. I pulled up to my own house at 4:17 in the afternoon, and the front yard looked like an estate sale that had already been rained on. My suitcases sat open on the grass, not stacked, open, as if someone had rifled through them and gotten bored. My late husband Samuel's framed photos were leaning against the bougainvillea we planted together the first year we moved in, 23 years ago. The glass catching the afternoon light in a way that made them look almost beautiful, which made everything worse. My children's baby albums, in a cardboard box, sitting in the dirt beside the water meter. My folders from the bottom of the filing cabinet. 40 years of tax returns, insurance documents, the deed to a condo I sold in 1998, the original paperwork from Samuel's life insurance, scattered, some of them face down, some of them damp at the edges. I sat in my car and looked at it. I didn't get out right away. I sat there and breathed through my nose and looked at my life arranged on the lawn like an apology nobody had bothered to make. And I thought about Grace, about how she used to say that the worst thing a person could do to another person was treat them like furniture, like something that takes up space rather than fills it. The front door opened. Danielle stepped onto the porch in a floral sundress, one hand on her hip, smiling the way she smiled when she wanted something and thought she was about to get it. "Oh, Mom, you're back!" I got out of the car. I did not slam the door. I closed it quietly. I walked to the gate and I looked at her. And I looked at my things and I looked at her again. "What is all of this, Danielle?" She came down the porch steps with a little bounce in her step, like she was delivering good news. "We did a deep clean while you were gone. I've been wanting to organize this place for months. All those old boxes were just taking up space. You'll feel so much better once everything's cleared out. I want you to understand something about that moment. I am 63 years old. I worked as an office manager at a medical practice for 31 years. I raised 2 children after my husband died of a heart attack at 54. I paid off this house in 14 years because I made a budget and kept to it every single month and never asked a single person for help I didn't have to. I have survived things that would bend most people in half. I have never once in my life put my hands on another person out of anger. That day I understood, for the first time, exactly how much will that actually takes." "Danielle," I said. My voice came out flat. Not angry, flat. The voice I used when I was writing someone up at work. The voice that meant this is the last time I'm going to say this. "That shawl is older than your mother. Those are my family's photographs. Those folders contain legal documents that cannot be replaced." She waved her hand, her actual hand, in the air, like I was being dramatic. "We need your room anyway. Didn't Robert tell you?" She tilted her head, cheerful as a weather forecast. "I'm 3 months pregnant. We're going to turn it into a nursery. Isn't that exciting?" I found out my son was going to be a father while standing in my own front yard, surrounded by my life in garbage bags, 9 hours after I buried my sister. I breathed. "Where am I sleeping?" I asked. She walked me around the side of the house to the utility room at the back. It was a room I used for the washer and dryer and overflow storage. 8 feet by 10 feet, maybe. A folding cot with a mattress that had a stain down one side the shape of the state of Florida. A single bare bulb on a pull string. One window the size of a shoebox, positioned so that all you could see through it was the alley wall, and, if you tilted your head, the neighbor's trash cans. No closet. "It's small," Danielle said brightly, "but you only need somewhere to sleep, right? And we'll get you a lamp." I stood in that doorway and looked at the room. I looked at her. "You're absolutely right," I said. "It is definitely time for a deep clean." She smiled, satisfied, like we had reached an agreement. She went back inside. I closed the door to the utility room, and I sat on the edge of that stained mattress, and I cried. I cried for Grace, who had been my best friend since before I had words for what a best friend was. I cried for Samuel, who would have walked Danielle off his property with 2 sentences and 0 ambiguity. I cried for the boy Robert used to be, the 7-year-old who brought me dandelions from the backyard, the teenager who held my hand in the hospital when Samuel was in the ICU, the young man who stood at the altar with tears running down his face on his wedding day and who I had, apparently, lost somewhere between then and now. I cried for about 9 minutes. Then I stopped. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my good black dress dress, which was already ruined anyway. I took out my phone. I photographed the cot, the mattress stain, the bare bulb, the window. I walked back around the house and photographed my suitcases on the grass, the baby albums in the dirt, my documents damp at the corners, Samuel's photos against the bougainvillea. I photographed the shawl on the garbage bag from 3 angles. Then I opened the Notes app on my phone and typed one sentence at the top. This did not start today. Let me tell you how long this had actually been going on. 14 months earlier, Robert had called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. Robert called on Sundays, reliably, at 7 o'clock, because that was the schedule we had maintained since he moved out and it was comfortable for both of us. A Tuesday call meant something was happening. He said he and Danielle were having trouble. The apartment lease was up in 2 months. Would it be possible, just temporarily, just until they got on their feet, to move in with me? He said temporarily. I want you to remember that word. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. I had a 4-bedroom house. I had been alone in it since Robert's sister Elena moved to Seattle 4 years prior. It echoed in ways I had gotten used to but never stopped noticing. Having Robert home, even Robert with a wife I had complicated feelings about, seemed like it might fill some of that. The first month was fine. The second month was fine. By the third month, I started noticing things. The first thing I noticed was the refrigerator. I am not a complicated woman. I do my grocery shopping on Saturdays. I cook on Sundays and Wednesdays. I take leftovers for lunch. I have done this since 1987. Suddenly, the leftovers were disappearing. The good containers, the glass ones I had spent actual money on, were being sent to Danielle's mother Patricia's house full of food and coming back empty, if they came back at all. I asked Robert about it gently once. He said he thought it was fine since it was all one family. I let it go. The rationalization of a woman who does not want to be right. Then there was the credit card. Robert had a card on one of my accounts. This was not new. I had added him when he was in college for emergencies. He had used it so rarely over the years that I had basically forgotten it existed. Beginning in month 4, I started seeing charges I didn't recognize. $80 at a restaurant I'd never been to. $160 at a home goods store. 3 charges to an online boutique that I had to look up to identify. I called Robert. He said Danielle had needed a few things and he'd told her to use the card. He thought he'd mentioned it. He had not mentioned it. He apologized. The charges stopped for about 3 weeks and then started again. I removed the card from the account. That was the first thing I did wrong, according to Danielle. Not wrong morally, wrong strategically, because it made her understand that I knew how to draw a line, which meant she needed to find approaches that I couldn't trace as easily. I didn't understand that yet. What I noticed next was the furniture. My mother had been a woman of specific and considered tastes. When she died in 2009, she left me several pieces that I valued more than almost anything else in the house. A walnut display cabinet with glass front doors, made in 1952, that had held her china and her small collection of Ladro figurines, a cedar chest, hand-carved, that had been a wedding gift to her and my father, 4 dining chairs that Samuel had refinished by hand the summer before he got sick, had stripped and sanded and stained them a warm honey color, and replaced all the rush seats himself, one by one, over 6 weekend afternoons. Samuel's hands had touched every inch of those chairs. By month 7, the walnut cabinet was gone. I noticed it on a Thursday morning, came downstairs for coffee, and the wall in the dining room was just blank. I stood there in my robe looking at the blank wall for a moment before I understood what I was looking at. I asked Danielle. She said she thought it was in the garage. It was not in the garage. I asked Robert. He said he wasn't sure. Maybe Danielle had moved it. He'd ask her. He did not get back to me on this. 1 month later, the cedar chest. Another month later, the dining chairs. All 4, replaced with a set from a big box store. Honey-colored wood, perfectly fine. Completely wrong. I stood at the dining table and put my hand on the back of one of the new chairs and tried to feel something other than the specific absence of Samuel's work under my palm. I couldn't. It was my neighbor Lucy Okafor, 68 years old, retired school teacher, the most observant human being I have ever known in my life, who told me what had actually happened. Lucy called me on a Saturday afternoon, voice careful, and said she wasn't sure if she should say something, but she thought I should know that a few weeks back, she had watched 2 men load a cabinet and a chest and some chairs into a pickup truck while Danielle stood in the driveway. She was counting something, Lucy said, like bills. I hung up the phone. I sat down. I got up. I went to my bedroom, the one Danielle would eventually empty while I was at my sister's funeral, and I found the notebook I used for household accounts. I opened a fresh section. I wrote the date, and I began writing down everything I could remember, every missing item, every unrecognized charge, every conversation I'd had with Robert that had ended without resolution. That notebook would eventually be 41 pages long, but that night I didn't know that yet. That night I just sat on my bed in my own house and tried to understand how I had let 8 months go by without seeing clearly what was in front of me. The answer, I think, is this. I did not want to believe that my son knew. I could believe that Danielle was taking advantage of a situation. I could not yet make myself believe that Robert was watching it happen. I told myself that story for 2 more months. Then I checked my savings account. I had kept a separate savings account since 1992, a simple, boring, high-yield account at a credit union 2 miles from my house. I contributed to it every single month for 31 years. It was not spectacular. It was not a fortune, but it represented decades of discipline and restraint, and the security of knowing that if something catastrophically wrong happened, I had somewhere to land. The balance, when I looked at it in October, was $11,400. 18 months earlier, it had been $57,200. I sat in my car in the credit union parking lot. I had driven there in person. I needed to see the paper statement. I needed to hold it in my hands. And I looked at that number and I tried to breathe. The withdrawals had started small. 200 here, 500 there, amounts that could have been anything. Then larger, then larger. Then a series of withdrawals in round numbers, 2,000, 3,000, 2,500, over 6 months that had taken my account from $57,000 to $11,400. My name was the only name on that account. But I had left my debit card in my wallet in the kitchen drawer on 3 separate occasions I could now specifically remember. Once in July when I had a bad cold, once in September when I was rushing to a doctor's appointment, once in October right before I flew to Phoenix because Grace was getting worse. Someone had used my card, someone who had access to my kitchen. I drove home. I went inside. Robert and Danielle were watching television in the living room when I was rushing to a doctor's appointment. Once in October right before I flew to Phoenix because Grace was getting worse. Someone had used my card, someone who had access to my kitchen. I drove home. I went inside. Robert and Danielle were watching television in the living room. I stood in the doorway and I thought about every version of this confrontation and what it would cost to have it too soon. If I spoke before I had everything in order, they would have time to prepare, to move things, change things, build a story. I had not paid off a house in 14 years to lose this fight because I was impatient. I went to my room. I called my attorney. Andrew Kim has been practicing real estate and estate law in this city for 27 years. He is a small, precise man with excellent posture and reading glasses. He wears low on his nose and a complete unwillingness to waste time on anything that isn't the matter at hand. He handled the sale of my 1998 condo. He drew up my will. He's one of 3 people I called after Samuel's funeral when I needed to understand what my financial picture looked like going forward. I had not needed him in 4 years. I called him on a Friday evening and left a message. I need an appointment as soon as possible. I have documentation. It is urgent. He called back within the hour. The following Monday, I sat across from him and put the notebook on the desk and the bank statements beside it, and Lucy Okafor's written account. I had asked her to write it down and sign it, and she had done this without hesitation, sitting at her kitchen table with her good fountain pen on top of the stack. Andrew read everything. He asked 3 questions. He looked at the bank statements for a long time. "Carol," he said finally, "do you understand that the deed to this house is still entirely in your name?" "Yes," I said. He set his glasses on the desk. "Then we have quite a bit to work with." He walked me through the options. Formal eviction. No landlord-tenant arrangement had ever been established, which meant Robert and Danielle were legally guests, not tenants, which meant the eviction process was considerably more straightforward than they would expect. A civil claim for the missing funds, a police report for the potential theft of property, the furniture specifically, because Lucy's signed account established that someone had facilitated its removal from the premises and received payment. He was careful with language. He used words like alleged and consistent with, and subject to further verification. He was also honest about the complications. "The banking situation is the hardest piece," he said. "You are the sole account holder. They will argue you made the withdrawals yourself. We need more than statements." I told him I had 8 more months of records I hadn't shown him yet. I told him about the timesheets, that I still had access to my former employer's HR system as a retiree, and that I could pull records showing exactly which days I had been at the office, which days I could not have been at my kitchen drawer. He put his glasses back on. "Come back Thursday," he said. "Bring everything." I came back Thursday, and the next Thursday, and the Thursday after that. By the time Grace called to tell me the doctors were recommending hospice, Andrew and I had built what he described in his restrained way as a very tidy case. He filed a police report, quietly. Detective Raymond Chu, Property Crimes Unit, 11 years on the force, called me on a Thursday afternoon and was methodical and unimpressed and thorough, which is exactly what I needed. He told me the evidence was consistent with a pattern, but that the banking institution would need to weigh in before any formal determination could be made. He said I should not discuss the matter with anyone in the house. "How long have you been sitting on this?" he asked. "About 4 months," I said. A pause. "Most people confront them first." "I know," I said. "And you didn't." "No." Another pause. Then, with something that might have been the beginning of professional respect, "Okay, we'll be in touch." Then Grace got worse. Very quickly, and I flew to Phoenix. I came home on a Tuesday to find my life on the front lawn. After I photographed everything, every suitcase, every damp document, every photo, I went in through the side kitchen door. Robert was standing at the counter. He heard me come in. He did not look up. That was the moment I stopped having any ambiguity about what he knew and had known. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at my kitchen table. I drank it. Robert eventually went upstairs without speaking a word to me. I rinsed my mug. I called Elena in Seattle, Robert's sister, my daughter, a structural engineer who does not cry during emergencies, and told her what had happened and what I had spent 4 months building and what I intended to do next. She listened without interrupting and at the end said, "Do you need me to come?" And I said, "Not yet," and she said, "Tell me the moment that changes." Then I called Andrew Kim at home. He answered on the second ring. "They did it while you were at the funeral," I said. A long pause. "Photographs?" "About 40 of them." "Carol," he said. I think we're ready. He had 3 documents prepared: a 30-day notice to vacate for Robert, a 30-day notice to vacate for Danielle separately, since she was not named on any document I had ever signed, and a formal demand letter for $45,800, the full accounting of what was missing from my account, with the 41-page documentation attached. He handed me the folder. You know they'll push back, he said. I know. Robert may not take this easily. I know that too. He looked at me over his glasses the way he sometimes did when he was deciding whether to say something. How are you? Honestly, I thought about Grace's handwriting. I thought about the shawl on the garbage bag. I'm very focused right now, I said. He nodded once. Then go. A silver Honda CR-V and a dark blue sedan. I noted them. I went inside. They were all at my dining room table. Danielle, Robert, at the far end, looking at the tablecloth, and Danielle's parents, Patricia and Harold Simmons, who on our first meeting had told me they had hoped Robert would marry someone from a similar background, which I had understood completely and filed away without comment. Patricia was in a cream blouse. Harold was in a sports coat. They had dressed for the occasion. Danielle smiled at me like nothing had happened. Mom, Robert said, we were hoping you'd be back. We wanted to talk. I'm listening, I said. I did not sit down. Harold did not waste time. He told me that Robert and Danielle were building a family and needed stability. He said this was a practical matter. He said a woman of my age, and the way he said my age communicated something other than a number, would surely understand the value of simplifying, right-sizing, making space for the next generation. Patricia nodded at each point, and then Harold slid a brochure across my dining room table. I looked at it. Full-color photographs, manicured paths, smiling seniors in garden chairs, the facility's name in a font designed to communicate dignity while delivering condescension. Sunrise Pines Senior Living Community. Very reasonable rates, Harold said, given the circumstances. I let him finish. I let Patricia explain that it wasn't personal, that of course family was everything, that at a certain point one had to be realistic about these things. I let Danielle add that she had looked it up online, and the reviews were apparently quite positive. I let every word land on the table. Then I picked up my folder. This house belongs to me, I said. Every room in it, including the room you converted into a nursery while I was burying my sister, and the utility room where you put me to sleep last night. Danielle laughed, not nervously, but the way someone laughs when they think they have already won. Robert said it was basically going to be ours anyway, estate planning and all. I looked at her steadily. Basically, I said, is not a legal term. The laugh stopped. I opened the folder. I set the first document on the table, then the second, then the demand letter, with the full accounting behind it. Harold's face changed. It went the color of old milk. That gray-white some people's faces go when the ground shifts and they realize they've been standing on something that belonged to someone else. Those are 30-day eviction notices, I said. One for each of you, properly issued and date stamped. And that is a formal demand for repayment of $45,800, representing the documented difference between my savings account balance 14 months ago and its current balance, cross-referenced against a timeline of withdrawals made while I was absent from this house. Patricia made a sound. Harold said I would never actually pursue this. I spread the bank records across the table. Lucy Okafor's signed statement, copies of my employment timesheets, and the summary from Andrew's office, which included on the third page the file number from Detective Raymond Chu's formal report. Every page. Harold, I said. He was staring at the police report number. I already did. The room went silent the way rooms go silent before something breaks. Robert was looking at the table. He had not looked up once since I began setting documents down. I watched the back of his neck and I thought about how well I knew that neck, had washed it when he was an infant, had checked it for sunburn every summer growing up, had put my hand on it gently the night we stood together at his father's graveside. And I thought, I am going to grieve this, but not today. Danielle's hands were flat on the table. Patricia had Harold's arm. My phone buzzed in my hand, a call coming in. I looked at the screen. A number I hadn't seen before, but the name I had saved next to it months ago, when Grace was still well enough to talk, when she had gripped my hand in her hospital room and said, "Write this down, Carol. Write it down. This is important." Grace's attorney, Margaret Fong. Estate law, 42 years of practice. I looked up from the phone. Harold was still talking. Danielle was saying something about contesting the eviction, about Robert's name ought to be on the deed anyway, about what a real family would never do to each other. I answered the call. Ms. Carol Whitfield? Margaret Fong's voice was precise and unhurried, the voice of someone who had been in rooms exactly like this one and always left standing. This is she, I said. I'm so sorry to call at what may be a difficult time. I'm calling regarding your sister Grace's estate. I believe she may have told you we would be in touch. A pause, the soft sound of a folder being opened. I don't know if she shared the full details with you. She revised her estate documents in September. She was very specific about wanting me to contact you immediately upon her passing. She mentioned there was something. I said, yes. Another pause. Your sister owned the deed to a property in Phoenix that she purchased in 2004. She designated you as sole beneficiary. The property was appraised in September at $1.4 million. I stood in my dining room with Robert and Danielle and Harold and Patricia watching me, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not break exactly, More like move. Like Grace had put her hand on my shoulder one last time and said, I saw what was coming. I made sure. She also left a letter, Margaret Fong said. Handwritten. She asked me to tell you that you would understand it when the time came. I looked at the 4 people sitting at my table. I looked at the eviction notices. I looked at the demand letter. I looked at Samuel's photograph, which I had retrieved from the yard that morning and placed back on the sideboard where it had always stood, next to the blank wall where my mother's walnut cabinet used to be. Ms. Fong, I said, I'm in the middle of a meeting. May I call you back in just a few minutes? Of course, she said. Take all the time you need. I hung up. I looked at Robert. For the first time since I had walked through the door, he looked back at me, and I could see it, really see him, the way you can only see someone when the performance is over. He looked afraid, not of me, of himself, of the distance between who he had been and who he had allowed himself to become while he told himself it wasn't really happening. I recognized that look. I had worn it for 8 months. You have 30 days, I said to the room. I picked up my folder and my phone and I walked outside to call Margaret Fong back. The letter from Grace was 3 paragraphs, written in her handwriting, big, definitive, the same slant she'd had since 4th grade. She said she had always known I was the one who would manage things. She said she had watched how people treated what I owned, what I had spent a lifetime building, and she had wanted to make sure I had something that was entirely mine. She said, you spent your whole life making room for other people. I wanted to give you somewhere nobody else could put their things. I stood on my porch in my black funeral dress, and the late afternoon went quiet around me, and I cried, properly, fully, without the 9-minute clock I had given myself in the utility room. I cried for all of it. For Grace at 7 years old making up rules for games she invented so I could always win. For Grace at 32 flying out when Samuel died. No warning, just there, all of it. For Grace at 7 years old making up rules for games she invented so I could always win. For Grace at 32 flying out when Samuel died. No warning, just there. For Grace at 61 in a hospital bed, still thinking about me, still making arrangements, still trying to leave me with somewhere to stand. Then I went inside and called Elena. You can come now, I said. I already booked the flight, she said. I land at 8. Harold and Patricia retained someone who sent a letter questioning the accounting, and Andrew responded with the full 41 pages plus the credit union's fraud assessment, which had been completed by then and agreed with my timeline in every material detail. Detective Chu called in late November. The banking institution had confirmed irregularities. The withdrawal patterns were inconsistent with my established spending history. The card had been used on 3 occasions when, per my own employment records, I had been at work. A formal investigation was underway. You kept excellent documentation, he said. My sister was an accountant, I said. She taught me everything I know about paperwork. The furniture case took longer. The consignment shop 16 miles away had intake records. Lucy's description of the pickup truck was consistent with those records. The walnut cabinet and the cedar chest were still in the shop's back inventory, unsold, and were returned to me. The dining chairs had been sold to a woman named Karen, who collected antiques and had paid a fair price and had absolutely no idea they were not being sold legitimately. I called Karen. I explained the situation. I told her what the chairs were, who had made them, who had refinished them, what their history was. She said, "Oh, honey," and agreed to sell them back at what she'd paid. I didn't negotiate. I didn't try to reduce the price. Samuel had made those chairs. I would have paid twice as much. Robert and Danielle moved out on a Wednesday morning with a rented truck, which told me Harold had accepted the situation was over. They moved in silence. Danielle walked past me in the kitchen without looking at me. Robert paused at the front door. "Mom," he said. I looked at him. He opened his mouth. He closed it. "I know," I said. I was not absolving him, but it was true. I did know. I knew that somewhere inside him was still the boy who had brought me dandelions. I knew that people we love are capable of failure that is entirely their responsibility and still somehow ours to carry. I knew that some losses are just losses, and that time and grief and grace, not the legal kind but the other kind, the kind my sister had embodied her entire life, would have to do the rest. "I know," I said again. He walked to the truck. I stood in the doorway of my house, and I watched him drive away. Elena came for 3 weeks. We repainted my bedroom the color I had always wanted it, a soft, deep green like the inside of a forest, and took down some things and put up others. We had Grace's shawl cleaned and repaired by a woman in the textile district who worked with heirloom pieces and who handled it when I brought it in with both hands. We put it on the armchair in the sitting room, where I can see it from the couch, in the light that comes through the south window in the afternoons. I eventually moved to Phoenix. Not right away. I spent 6 months at home first, in the house I had paid off and earned and refused to give away, letting it be mine again, letting the rooms be quiet. Grace's house in Phoenix is low and wide, with terracotta tile and a garden she planted herself over 20 years, full of things that bloom in colors I didn't have names for when I arrived. I've learned the names now. I have time for that. I hung Samuel's photograph in the hallway the day I moved in. I put Grace's shawl on the armchair by the window, where the afternoon light hits it the same way it hit Samuel's photos leaning against the bougainvillea. That Tuesday, I came home from the worst day of my life. Almost the same way, a little warmer here. The light in Phoenix does something different to gold. Grace's letter is framed beside Samuel's photograph. I reread the last line sometimes in the mornings before the garden gets too warm to sit in. You spent your whole life making room for other people. I wanted to give you somewhere nobody else could put their things. Nobody will be throwing my things on any lawn again. I made sure of that, and she made sure of me.